In the autumn of 210 BC, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, died on a tour of his eastern provinces. The official announcement of his death was delayed for weeks. Inside the imperial carriage, his body was kept hidden behind drawn curtains, surrounded by fish to mask the smell of decay. His chief eunuch and a handful of ministers conspired to place a weak successor on the throne. Within 3 years, the Qin dynasty, which had unified China through iron discipline and total war, began to collapse from within. Rebellions erupted across the empire. Armies raised by local warlords marched on the capital. By 206 BC, the last Qin ruler had surrendered. China was no longer united. It was a battlefield. What happened? The collapse of the Qin dynasty left a power vacuum that no single faction could immediately fill. The most prominent rebel leader was Xiang Yu, a general from the former state of Chu. He was a man of immense personal strength and battlefield charisma. In 207 BC, at the Battle of Julu, he had crushed the main Qin army, breaking its backbone. After the Qin surrender, Xiang Yu declared himself the hegemon king of Western Chu and divided the empire into 18 kingdoms, parceled out to his allies and rivals. Among those rivals was a man named Liu Bang, a former village constable who had risen from obscurity to lead a rebel band. Xiang Yu gave Liu Bang a remote and poor territory called the Kingdom of Han, in what is now Sichuan and southern Shanxi. It was meant to be a prison, not a throne. But Liu Bang did not see it that way. In the spring of 206 BC, he led his army through the treacherous mountain passes into the Han Valley. He burned the wooden walkways behind him, a signal to Xiang Yu that he had no intention of returning east. It was a feint. Liu Bang used the isolation to rebuild his forces, train his troops, and gather supplies. He was patient. He was not a brilliant tactician like Xiang Yu, but he understood logistics, loyalty, and timing. Over the next 4 years, the two men fought a war that would decide the fate of China. It is known as the Chu-Han contention. By the summer of 203 BC, the war had reached a stalemate. Both sides were exhausted. Xiang Yu offered a truce, dividing China along the Hangul Canal, a line that marked the boundary between east and west. The treaty was signed. Xiang Yu withdrew his forces. Liu Bang agreed to the terms, but his advisors urged him not to honor them. The most influential of these advisors was Zhang Liang, a strategist who had studied ancient texts and understood the nature of power. He told Liu Bang that Xiang Yu was too dangerous to leave alive. Liu Bang broke the treaty and pursued Xiang Yu's retreating army. The final confrontation came in December 202 BC at the Battle of Gaixia. Liu Bang's forces surrounded Xiang Yu's camp. That night, Han soldiers sang folk songs from Chu, a psychological ploy to make Xiang Yu's troops believe their homeland had already fallen. Xiang Yu, hearing the songs, was struck with despair. He attempted a breakout with a small cavalry force. He fought his way through Han lines, killing hundreds, but was eventually cornered at the Wu River. Offered a boat to escape, he refused, saying he could not face his ancestors after losing so many men. He drew his sword and cut his own throat. The war was over. On the 28th day of the second month of 202 BC, Liu Bang declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. He took the temple name Geazu, meaning high progenitor. He called his dynasty the Han, after the kingdom Xiang Yu had given him as a trap. The capital was established at Chang'an, a city built on the ruins of the Qin capital near modern Xi'an. The Han Dynasty would last for more than 400 years, interrupted only by a brief interregnum, and its name would become the word for the Chinese people themselves. But how did this happen? How did a minor constable from a small county become the founder of an empire that defined Chinese civilization for 2 millennia? The answer lies in the systems Liu Bang built and the mistakes of those who came before him. The Qin dynasty had unified China through harsh laws, standardized writing, currency, and measurements, and massive public works. But it had also conscripted millions of peasants for forced labor, taxed them without mercy, and executed anyone who spoke against the government. When the Qin fell, the people were desperate for order but not for tyranny. Liu Bang understood this. He abolished the most brutal Qin laws. He reduced taxes. He granted land to soldiers who had fought for him. He made peace with the powerful local families who controlled the countryside. His government was not gentle, but it was pragmatic, and that pragmatism became a template for every Han emperor who followed. The central challenge Liu Bang faced in 202 BC was how to hold together a territory larger than any previous Chinese state had controlled. He did not trust a purely centralized system like the Qin, because he had seen how quickly that system collapsed. Instead, he created a hybrid. The empire was divided into two kinds of territories: commanderies, directly ruled by the imperial government, and kingdoms, ruled by princes who were either his sons or loyal allies. The princes had their own armies and courts, but they were required to pay tribute and follow imperial decrees. It was a fragile compromise, and for the first decades of the Han, it nearly tore the dynasty apart. In the autumn of 196 BC, Liu Bang died from an arrow wound suffered during a campaign against a rebellious vassal. His son, Emperor Hui, was a weak ruler, and the real power passed to the Empress Dowager Lu Zhai. She was a shrewd and ruthless woman. She eliminated rivals, executed her husband's favorite concubine in gruesome fashion, and ruled through her son and then her grandsons. For 15 years, the Lu clan controlled the imperial court. When she died in 180 BC, a coalition of princes and generals rose up and exterminated the Lu family. They placed a new emperor on the throne, Liu Heng, the Prince of Dai, who would reign as Emperor Wen. Emperor Wen and his son, Emperor Jing, are remembered for their restraint. They reduced taxes further, cut government spending, and encouraged agriculture. They also faced the problem of the powerful kingdoms. In 154 BC, 7 of those kingdoms rebelled simultaneously. The revolt was crushed within 3 months, and the emperors used the victory to break up the largest kingdoms and place them under tighter imperial control. The hybrid system slowly gave way to a more centralized state, but one that was still far more flexible than the Qin had been. Then came Emperor Wu, who ascended the throne in 141 BC at the age of 15. He would reign for 54 years. Under Wu, the Han Dynasty expanded in every direction. He sent armies into the northern steppes to crush the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that had raided Chinese settlements for centuries. He pushed south into what is now Vietnam and Korea. He opened the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that connected China to Central Asia, India, Persia, and eventually the Roman Empire. Han merchants traded silk, iron, and lacquerware for horses, glass, and spices. The empire became a world power, but expansion had a cost. Emperor Wu's campaigns were expensive. He raised taxes, nationalized salt and iron production, and printed money to pay for his armies. He also began to rely heavily on a new class of officials, men selected not by birth but by merit, through examinations that tested their knowledge of Confucian texts. This was a radical departure from older systems, where noble families controlled government positions. Under Wu, the Confucian classics became the curriculum for training bureaucrats. The examination system, refined over centuries, would remain the backbone of Chinese government until the 20th century. It is worth pausing here to understand what the Han Dynasty accomplished that the Qin had not. The Qin had imposed unity through force. The Han made unity feel natural. They created a shared culture. Under the Han, the written language became standardized to a degree that all educated people across the empire could communicate in the same script. They compiled histories, most famously the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, which set the standard for historical writing in East Asia. They promoted Confucianism as a state ideology, emphasizing filial piety, loyalty, and ritual. Schools were established in every prefecture. The Imperial University in Chang'an grew to hold thousands of students. The Han also made technological advances that changed the world. Iron casting became sophisticated, allowing for stronger plows and weapons. Paper was invented, traditionally credited to the eunuch Kai Lun in 105 AD, though earlier examples exist. Water clocks and seismographs were developed. The first known book on agriculture, Fan Shengzhai's treatise, provided instructions on crop rotation and irrigation. Medicine advanced, with physicians writing detailed texts on acupuncture and pharmacology. But the empire was not invincible. By the end of the 1st century BC, the Han government was weakened by corruption, court intrigues, and the growing power of eunuchs within the palace. Emperors came to the throne as children, and regents or eunuchs ruled in their name. The tax system became unfair, with wealthy families avoiding payments while peasants bore the burden. Landless farmers became tenants, then debtors, then serfs. Discontent simmered. In 9 AD, a regent named Wang Mang usurped the throne and founded a short-lived Han Dynasty. His reforms were well-intentioned but catastrophic. They provoked widespread rebellion, and Wang Mang was killed in 23 AD. The Han Dynasty was restored a year later, but it was never the same. This restored Han, known as the Eastern Han because the capital was moved east to Luoyang, lasted for nearly 200 more years. It continued to expand, especially westward into Central Asia. It maintained the Silk Road. It fought the Xiongnu and other nomadic groups, but internal decay was relentless. The court was torn by factionalism. Eunuchs massacred their rivals in 168 AD, then were themselves slaughtered in 189 AD. Warlords emerged, ignoring the central government. In 184 AD, a massive religious uprising known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion swept through the country. It was suppressed, but the empire was broken into pieces. In 220 AD, the last Han emperor, a child named Liu Zai, was forced to abdicate. The dynasty ended. China entered a period of division that would last for 3 centuries. Why does the Han Dynasty still matter? Because its institutions, its language, its philosophy, and its symbols became the DNA of Chinese civilization. When later dynasties wanted to claim legitimacy, they invoked the Han. When Chinese people today call themselves Han Chinese, they are referring to that dynasty. The Han set the boundaries of what China considered its natural territory. They established the ideal of a unified, centralized empire governed by a merit-based bureaucracy. They created a cultural identity that survived the collapse of the dynasty and every crisis that followed. But the Han Dynasty was not a single, seamless story. It was a history of invention and violence, of brilliance and cruelty, of ambition and collapse. The systems that made it strong also contained the seeds of its destruction. How could an empire that lasted 400 years fall so completely? What happened in those final decades that turned a stable world into a battlefield? The answers are found not in one event, but in a slow accumulation of failures, choices, and missed signals. In the late summer of the year 189 AD, a power struggle in the capital city of Luoyang reached its breaking point. On the 25th day of the 9th month, according to the Han calendar, a man named He Jin, the regent and commander-in-chief, walked through the southern gate of the imperial palace. He had been summoned by the Empress Dowager, and he went without his guards, trusting that his authority would protect him. Something was off. He Jin had been the most powerful man in the empire for nearly a year. He had eliminated his chief rival, the eunuch giant Xiuo, and had taken control of the imperial guard. But the eunuch faction in the palace had not been destroyed. They had only gone underground. What happened next is recorded in the chronicles of the later Han and in the records of the 3 kingdoms. As He Jin entered the main hall, the eunuch Zhang Rang and several of his allies emerged from behind a screen. They were armed. Zhang Rang accused He Jin of planning to exterminate the eunuch corps. He Jin tried to argue, but the eunuchs did not negotiate. They killed him on the spot and ordered his head to be thrown over the palace wall. The signal was immediate. Outside, He Jin's chief lieutenant, Yuan Shao, had been waiting with a force of soldiers. When he saw the head, he gave the order to storm the palace. The gates were forced open, and the soldiers rushed in. They did not pause to distinguish between eunuchs and palace staff. They killed everyone they could find, men, women, children, and eunuchs alike. The massacre lasted for hours. Several hundred eunuchs were butchered. Some fled, but many were cornered and hacked to pieces. The Empress Dowager and the young Emperor Liu Bian were taken into protective custody by Yuan Shao and his ally, a general named Dong Zhuo, who had arrived with his own army from the western frontier. The sequence of events that day had been building for months. He Jin had been trying to consolidate control over the court, but the eunuchs had deep roots. They had controlled access to the emperor for decades. They had murdered rivals, manipulated succession, and enriched themselves. He Jin had been warned by his advisors that the eunuchs would not surrender peacefully. He had ignored those warnings. He had also refused to bring a larger army into the capital, believing he could manage the situation with diplomacy. That miscalculation cost him his life, but the massacre of eunuchs did not solve the problem. It only made it worse. Dong Zhuo, a brutal and ambitious general, now held the capital. He deposed the young emperor and replaced him with his younger brother Liu Zai, who would rule as Emperor Xian. Dong Zhuo declared himself chancellor and began a reign of terror. He looted the treasury, burned villages, and killed anyone who opposed him. The imperial court became a prison. In the year 190 AD, a coalition of eastern warlords formed to oppose Dong Zhuo. He responded by burning Luoyang to the ground and moving the capital west to Chang'an. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the chaos. The Han Dynasty's infrastructure, carefully built over 4 centuries, was systematically dismantled. What happened? The massacre of the eunuchs on that September day was not a single cause of the dynasty's fall, but it was the moment when the system of checks and balances, already corroded by corruption and incompetence, finally collapsed. The eunuchs had been a necessary evil for many late Han emperors. They were trusted because they had no families, no independent power base, and could be controlled, at least in theory. But by the 2nd century, they had become a shadow government. They controlled access to the throne, managed the imperial treasury, and placed their relatives in important positions. They had killed officials who tried to expose them. They had engineered the deaths of several empresses, and they had created a climate of fear that paralyzed the bureaucracy. How could this have happened? The system itself had allowed it. The Eastern Han emperors often ascended as children, and their regents, usually their mothers or uncles, relied on eunuchs to manage the palace. Over time, the eunuchs learned to exploit their proximity to power. They also learned that they could survive any purge by playing factions against each other. The emperor himself was often isolated, fed false information, and manipulated into making decisions that benefited the eunuchs. By the reign of Emperor Huan, who died in 168 AD, the eunuch problem had become the central issue in court politics. A major purge of eunuchs was attempted in that year, but it backfired. The eunuchs rallied, arrested and executed their opponents, and tightened their grip. Then came the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 AD. That massive uprising, led by a charismatic healer named Zhang Jiao, swept through the countryside. The imperial army, weakened by decades of corruption, struggled to contain it. Local warlords were given emergency powers to raise troops. They succeeded in crushing the rebellion, but they never gave up those powers. The warlords became independent rulers in their own territories. The central government had lost control of the provinces. The economy was in shambles. Famine, banditry, and local uprisings became normal. The court in Luoyang was now a hollow shell, and the eunuchs were fighting among themselves for control of the emperor. In the year 188 AD, Emperor Ling died. He was succeeded by his 13-year-old son, Liu Bian. The Empress Dowager, He Jin's sister, became regent. He Jin himself was a butcher by trade, not a statesman. He had risen to power through his sister's position, and he was out of his depth. He surrounded himself with advisors who gave him contradictory advice. He vacillated between confrontation and negotiation. He Jin's plan to eliminate the eunuchs was known to everyone in the palace, including the eunuchs themselves. They had spies everywhere. He Jin never realized that his own brother, He Miao, had been secretly cooperating with the eunuchs. The same day He Jin was killed, He Miao was also murdered by loyalist troops, but the damage was done. The investigation that followed the massacre by later historians, not by any official inquiry at the time, examined the records of the final years. They found a pattern of missed signals. He Jin had been warned by his advisor Cao Cao, then a minor official, that the eunuchs would not surrender. He had been warned by Yuan Shao to act decisively. Instead, he tried to negotiate. The eunuchs, for their part, had attempted to assassinate He Jin earlier that year but failed. They left no written record of their own plans, but their actions speak clearly. They knew they were cornered and they chose to fight. After the massacre, the systems that had held the empire together failed in cascade. The military chain of command broke down. Dong Zhuo's army was not loyal to the emperor, it was loyal to Dong Zhuo. The provincial governors, who had been appointed by the central government, now declared themselves independent. Tax revenues stopped flowing to Luoyang. The official currency, which had already been debased, became worthless. The examination system, which had produced capable bureaucrats for centuries, ceased to function. The Confucian schools closed. The libraries were burned when Luoyang fell. The aftermath is well known. Dong Zhuo was assassinated in 192 AD by his own bodyguard Lu Bu, who had been bribed by a rival warlord. The chaos continued. The Emperor Xian became a pawn in the hands of competing warlords. He was eventually taken by Cao Cao, who used him as a figurehead to issue decrees in the emperor's name. Cao Cao's son, Cao Pai, forced the emperor to abdicate in 220 AD, formally ending the Han Dynasty. But the Han had been dead in practice for decades. The empire was already divided into three competing kingdoms: Wei, Shu, and Wu. The period of the three kingdoms, which has been romanticized in literature and legend, was in reality a time of constant war, mass displacement, and demographic collapse. Why does this episode still matter? Because it shows how a stable system can unravel from within. The Han Dynasty did not fall because of a barbarian invasion or a natural disaster. It fell because the mechanisms of governance, the checks on power, the flow of information, the trust between the ruler and the ruled, decayed to the point of failure. The eunuch problem was a symptom, not the cause. The cause was a court that had become disconnected from the provinces, a bureaucracy that had become corrupt, and an emperor who was isolated from reality. The Han Dynasty had been built on the idea that a virtuous ruler, advised by wise ministers, could maintain harmony between heaven and earth. When that harmony broke, the mandate of heaven was said to be withdrawn. But the Han also left a legacy that outlasted its fall. The ideal of a unified empire, the use of written examinations to select officials, the Confucian code of ethics, these survived the chaos and were revived by later dynasties. The Tang, the Song, the Ming, and the Qing all looked back to the Han as their model. In the specific case of the year 189 AD, the missed signals were not just about the eunuch plot. They were about the broader failure of the imperial system to adapt to changing realities. The population had grown. The economy had become more complex. The frontier had expanded. The old methods of control, relying on personal loyalty, maintaining a small central army, allowing local elites to manage their territories, were no longer sufficient. The Han rulers tried to patch the system with increased taxation, conscription, and repression, but they never addressed the fundamental imbalances. One of the most telling details is the treatment of the emperor himself. During the years of eunuch dominance, the emperor was often kept in a state of ignorance. He was told that the people were prosperous, that the borders were secure, that the court was harmonious. The reality was very different. When Emperor Ling died, the treasury was empty. The granaries were depleted. The army had not been paid in months. The eunuchs had been hoarding wealth and hiding the situation. No one dared to tell the emperor the truth. That information failure is a classic pattern in the collapse of authoritarian systems. The ruler becomes a prisoner of his own court. The men who tried to reform the system, like the scholar official Chen Fan and the general Du Wu in the earlier purge of 168 AD, were executed. The faction that opposed the eunuchs, known as the pure critics, were exiled or killed. After that, the bureaucracy was staffed by sycophants. The impartial examination system, which had been the pride of the Han, was corrupted. Appointments were sold. Promotions went to the highest bidders. The local gentry, who had once been the backbone of Han governance, turned inward. They built fortified estates, hired private armies, and stopped paying taxes. The empire fragmented from the bottom up. By the time He Jin walked into the palace on that September day, the empire was already a corpse. The only question was who would deliver the final blow. He Jin's assassination was that blow. The massacre that followed was not a solution but a convulsion. It left the capital in ruins, the imperial family in captivity, and the provinces in the hands of warlords. The Han Dynasty, which had defined what it meant to be Chinese, flickered out. Yet the name Han did not disappear. It became the name of a people, a language, a script, a culture. The failures of the late Han taught later dynasties hard lessons about the dangers of court factionalism, the need for transparent information, and the importance of maintaining a balance between central power and local autonomy. Those lessons were not always heeded, but they were remembered. The collapse of the Han was not the end of Chinese civilization. It was a transition, painful and destructive, but one that eventually led to a new synthesis. The story of the Han Dynasty is not a simple arc of rise and fall. It is a story of repeated attempts to build an enduring structure on a vast and diverse territory. The dynasty succeeded for longer than most empires in world history, but it also failed, and the flaws that brought it down were built into its design from the beginning. The hybrid system of commanderies and kingdoms, the reliance on eunuchs, the isolation of the emperor, the corrosion of the examination system, these were not accidents. They were choices made by emperors and ministers who believed they were solving immediate problems. They solved those problems, only to create new ones that would take centuries to resolve. The unanswered questions remain. Could the Han Dynasty have survived if He Jin had acted more decisively? Could the eunuch problem have been solved without violence? Could a different emperor have restored the trust between the court and the provinces? Historians continue to debate these questions, but the evidence suggests that by the late 2nd century, the empire was beyond repair. The rot had gone too deep. The best that could be hoped for was a slow decline, but the violence of the warlord era accelerated the collapse and caused far more suffering than a gradual dissolution would have. What investigators, in this case, historians like Fan Yi, who compiled the Book of the Later Han in the 5th century, found was a pattern of small failures that added up to a catastrophe. They documented the names of the eunuchs, the dates of the assassinations, the texts of the imperial decrees. They also recorded the stories of the common people, the farmers who lost their land, the soldiers who were never paid, the scholars who were jailed for speaking the truth. Those voices are faint, but they are present in the historical record. They remind us that the fall of a great empire is not an abstract event. It is a tragedy that unfolds in the lives of millions of people who had no control over the decisions made in a distant capital. The Han Dynasty ended in 220 AD, but its shadow is still long. Every time a Chinese scholar writes in the standardized script, every time a government official is selected by competitive examination, every time the ideal of a unified China is invoked, the Han is there. The empire that defined China was also the empire that taught China what it meant to fall. That duality is what makes it a story worth telling, not for sleep, but for understanding. In the 2nd month of the 1st year of the Zhongping reign period, corresponding to March of the year 184 AD, something stirred in the eastern provinces of the Han Empire. It was not a barbarian raid or a border skirmish. It was a mass movement led by a charismatic healer named Zhang Jiao. He called himself the great teacher of the way of supreme peace. His followers wore yellow headscarves. They believed that the Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and that a new era was about to begin. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had started. What happened next was a cascade of uprisings across 16 provinces. At its peak, the rebellion involved hundreds of thousands of peasants, farmers, laborers, and displaced people. They were armed with farm tools, wooden clubs, and improvised weapons. They burned government offices, killed officials, and seized granaries. The Han court in Luoyang received reports of chaos daily, but the court had been paralyzed by infighting among eunuchs and scholar officials. The emperor at the time was Ling, a man who had been raised by eunuchs and trusted them above everyone else. He was told that the rebellions were minor disturbances that would be quickly suppressed. They were not minor. The first signal that something was seriously wrong came in the fourth month of that year. A memorial from a provincial governor reached the capital. It described a coordinated uprising timed to coincide with a solar eclipse, an omen that heaven was displeased. The governor named the leaders, Zhang Jiao and his brothers, Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang. They had been planning for a decade, recruiting followers under the guise of faith healing and charitable works. They had set a date for a simultaneous revolt across the empire. Someone had leaked the plan to the authorities, but the warning came too late. The rebellion had already begun. How could this have happened? The Han Dynasty had a system of local officials, census records, and military garrisons designed to prevent exactly this kind of insurrection. But the system had eroded. Tax revenues had been falling for decades as wealthy landowners evaded taxes, and the central government lost control of the provinces. Local officials were often appointed based on connections rather than merit. The census data was years out of date. The garrisons were underfunded and undersupplied. When the Yellow Turbans rose, many local magistrates simply fled or were killed. The empire's early warning system had failed. The court responded by mobilizing the army. General He Jin, the same man who would later be assassinated in the eunuch plot, was placed in command of the imperial forces. He ordered troops from the northern frontiers to march south. He also made a decision that would have long-term consequences. He authorized local governors and warlords to raise their own private armies to fight the rebels. On paper, this seemed like a pragmatic solution. In practice, it gave regional strongmen the legal authority to build independent military power bases. Men like Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Jian, the future founders of the Three Kingdoms, got their start fighting Yellow Turbans. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but not quickly. By the time the last Yellow Turban strongholds were eliminated in the year 185 AD, the empire had been scarred. Entire counties were depopulated. Farmland lay fallow. The army had been depleted and the treasury was empty. The court had to pay for the war by debasing the currency, which led to inflation. The price of grain soared. Famine followed. Refugees streamed into the cities, spreading disease. In the capital, the eunuchs and the scholar officials continued their power struggle, each side blaming the other for the disaster. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was not an isolated event. It was the symptom of a deeper failure of governance. The peasants who joined the rebellion did not do so because they were swayed by Zhang Jiao's religious teachings alone. They joined because they had no other options. The Han land system had concentrated wealth in the hands of a few large landowners. Small farmers were forced into debt, then lost their land, then became tenants or beggars. When a drought or a flood struck, there was no safety net. The granaries that the Han government had built in earlier centuries were often empty because local officials had stolen the grain or sold it for profit. Zhang Jiao promised a world where the land would be redistributed and the poor would be fed. That message resonated because the reality was so brutal. Missed signals were everywhere. In the years before the rebellion, scholars and officials had written warnings about the growing inequality and the restlessness of the peasantry. One memorial from the year 173 AD explicitly warned that if the court did not address the land crisis, a great uprising was inevitable. The memorial was ignored. Another signal came from the religious sphere. Zhang Jiao's sect, the Way of Supreme Peace, had been spreading openly for years. Local authorities had reported it as a harmless healing cult. No one looked deeper. When a former member of the sect turned informant and revealed the planned uprising, the court sent soldiers to arrest Zhang Jiao, but he had already moved to a safe location. The arrest mission failed. The rebellion itself exposed a critical weakness in the Han military system. The standing army was designed for border defense, not internal counterinsurgency. It was slow to move and hard to supply. When the Yellow Turbans attacked multiple provinces at once, the army was stretched thin. The court had to rely on regional forces led by aristocratic families. Those families, like the Yuans and the Cows, used the rebellion to build their own power. They recruited soldiers from their own estates, armed them with their own resources, and then expected rewards from the court. When the rebellion ended, these private armies did not disband. They remained loyal to their commanders, not to the emperor. The seeds of warlord rule were planted in the mud of the Yellow Turban campaign. Investigators of the period, later historians like Sima Guang in the 11th century, looked at the financial records and found a damning pattern. The Han government had spent vast sums on the imperial court's luxuries, the construction of palaces, the maintenance of the harem, the salaries of eunuchs. Meanwhile, flood control projects, irrigation canals, and road repairs were neglected. When the Yellow Turbans rose, the state had no reserves to fund a relief effort. It had to borrow from wealthy families, further increasing their influence. The cost of war was passed on to the peasantry through higher taxes and corvée labor, but the peasants could not pay and would not work. They rebelled instead. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates put the number of deaths during the rebellion itself at several 100,000. The subsequent famine and disease added millions more. In some regions, the population dropped by more than half. Whole villages were abandoned. The land returned to wilderness. Wolves and bandits roamed where fields had once been. The empire that had once stretched from the Gobi Desert to the South China Sea was now a patchwork of devastated provinces barely connected to the capital. Why does this matter? Because the Yellow Turban Rebellion was the point of no return for the Han Dynasty. Before 184 AD, the empire was struggling but still intact. Afterward, it was in terminal decline. The rebellion forced the court to delegate military authority to local warlords, and those warlords never gave it back. The rebellion also destroyed the fiscal base of the state. The land tax system, which had been the backbone of Han revenue, collapsed because the land was no longer productive, and the tax collectors could not enforce collection. The court resorted to selling noble titles and official positions to raise money, further corrupting the bureaucracy. The rebellion also changed the social fabric. The Confucian gentleman official, who had been the ideal of Han governance, was replaced in many regions by the military strongman. Scholars were sidelined. Arms and violence became the currency of power. The way of supreme peace, though suppressed, did not vanish. Its ideas influenced later Taoist movements and secret societies. The yellow headscarf became a symbol of resistance against oppressive authority, used again and again in Chinese history. In the capital, the eunuchs and the scholar officials drew the wrong lessons from the rebellion. Instead of uniting to reform the system, they blamed each other. The eunuchs claimed that the rebellion was caused by corrupt local officials, many of whom were from the scholar faction. The scholars claimed that the rebellion was caused by eunuch misrule and the emperor's neglect. Both sides were partly right, but neither was interested in a solution. They only wanted to destroy the other. This infighting set the stage for the coup and massacre of 189 AD, which would finish off the Han Dynasty for good. The Yellow Turban Rebellion is also a story of missed opportunities. If the Han court had responded to the early warnings, if it had addressed land reform, if it had reduced corruption, if it had listened to the voices of the poor, the rebellion might never have happened. But the court was isolated. The emperor was told only what the eunuchs wanted him to hear. The provincial officials were afraid to report bad news because they might be punished for it. The information system, which should have been the empire's immune system, was infected with fear and self-interest. What investigators found was that the rebellion itself was not a random explosion. It was organized. Zhang Jiao had a hierarchical command structure, with generals, deputies, and local leaders. He had a communication network using letters and messengers. He had a plan for simultaneous attacks. The Han government, by contrast, was reactive and fragmented. It had no intelligence network inside the provinces. It relied on memorials from officials who often had their own agendas. The Yellow Turbans knew the Han weaknesses because they lived with them every day. The aftermath of the rebellion saw the rise of one man who would come to dominate the late Han, Cao Cao. He fought in the campaign against the Yellow Turbans and impressed his superiors with his tactical skill. He also took thousands of surrendered Yellow Turbans into his own army, incorporating them into his forces. This was a new kind of warfare, where the resources of the defeated were absorbed rather than destroyed. Cao Cao understood that the old Han system was dead, and he built his power on the ruins. He could do this because the rebellion had cleared the board. But Cao Cao was not a savior. He was a warlord. He fought for his own survival and expansion. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had taught him that the peasantry could be a source of soldiers, but also that they could turn against you if you did not feed them. He implemented land resettlement and agricultural colonies, but they were designed to feed his army, not to help the poor. The moral vision of the Han had been replaced by pragmatism and force. The rebellion also left a psychological scar on the Chinese elite. They had believed that their civilization was stable, that Confucian ethics would hold society together. The Yellow Turbans proved otherwise. The poor, when pushed far enough, would reject the entire moral order. They would follow a healer who claimed to have magical powers and who promised to replace the dynasty with a utopia. The Han elites never fully recovered from that shock. Their confidence was broken. In the decades that followed, the empire fragmented. The warlords fought each other, and the people suffered. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was not the last great peasant uprising in Chinese history, but it was the first to strike at the heart of the empire. It showed that a dynasty could be brought low not by barbarians from beyond the wall, but by its own people, from within the wall. The unanswered questions remain. Could the Han have survived if it had suppressed the Yellow Turbans more quickly? Could it have regained the loyalty of the peasantry through reform? The evidence suggests that the rebellion was a symptom, not a cause. The disease was already fatal. The rebellion only accelerated the inevitable. What historians have pieced together from the scattered records of local gazetteers, tax registers, and military dispatches is a picture of an empire that had become too large and too rigid to adapt. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was the moment when the gap between the rulers and the ruled became unbridgeable. The emperor in his palace was a distant figure. The eunuchs were hated. The officials were corrupt. The peasants had no one to speak for them, so they spoke with yellow headscarves and wooden clubs. The rebellion ended in 185 AD, but the war did not. The chaos it unleashed would last for almost a century, until the empire was reunified under the Jin Dynasty in 280 AD. By then, the Han was a memory, a golden age that would be endlessly invoked by later generations as a symbol of what China could be when it was united and peaceful. But that golden age had been built on the backs of the peasants who rose up in yellow and were crushed. The story of the Yellow Turban Rebellion is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of a system that stopped working and the human cost of that failure. The missed signals, the delayed responses, the corruption, the inequality, these are not unique to the Han Dynasty. They are patterns that appear in the collapse of many civilizations. The Han fell because it could no longer meet the basic needs of its people. The Yellow Turbans were the signal that the mandate of heaven had already been withdrawn. Court just didn't want to hear it. At approximately noon on the 22nd of September in the year 189 AD, a man entered the imperial palace in Luoyang. He was General-in-Chief He Jin, the most powerful official in the Han Empire. He was also walking into a trap. The palace doors closed behind him. Inside the main hall, The eunuch officials who controlled access to the young Emperor Liu Bian were waiting. They had received word of He Jin's plan to exterminate them. They had also received a secret signal from the Empress Dowager He Jin's own half-sister, who had been persuaded by the eunuchs to summon him to a private meeting. At that meeting, the eunuchs confronted He Jin. They accused him of treason. Before he could speak, a eunuch named Zhang Rang rushed at him with a hidden dagger. He Jin was struck down. His head was cut off and thrown over the palace wall as a warning to his followers. What happened next was not a calculated coup. It was a chain reaction. He Jin's chief lieutenant, Yuan Shao, had been waiting outside the palace with armed troops. When He Jin's head appeared over the wall, Yuan Shao ordered an immediate assault. His soldiers broke down the gates. They poured into the palace complex, killing every eunuch they could find. The eunuchs had held power in Luoyang for decades, controlling access to the emperor and manipulating appointments. Now they were hunted through the halls, the gardens, the temples. Some tried to flee. Others barricaded themselves in the inner palaces. Yuan Shao's men set fire to the buildings to flush them out. The palace of the Han Emperor, the seat of the empire's authority, was burning. The smoke rose above Luoyang. Citizens in the city saw it and understood that the government had collapsed. The eunuch leader Zhang Rang escaped with the young Emperor Liu Bian and his brother, the Prince of Chenliu. They fled through a secret tunnel that led out of the palace walls. Zhang Rang hoped to reach the Yellow River, where loyalist troops might protect him. But Yuan Shao's cavalry were already on the move. The emperor and his brother were found wandering the countryside near the river, alone and terrified. Zhang Rang had drowned himself in the river when he realized he could not escape. The emperor was brought back to Luoyang, but his authority was gone. The palace was in ruins. The eunuch faction was dead. The scholar-official faction, led by Yuan Shao, was now in nominal control, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. How could this have happened? The chain of events that led to the massacre of 189 AD began with the Yellow Turban Rebellion. After 184 AD, the Han court had been forced to delegate military command to regional governors and warlords. He Jin was one of those warlords, but he was also the brother-in-law of the previous emperor. He had risen to power through family connection, not through military achievement. He was insecure, indecisive, and surrounded by advisors who gave conflicting advice. The scholar officials wanted him to destroy the eunuchs. The eunuchs wanted him to destroy the scholars. He Jin tried to please both sides, and that made him vulnerable. The missed signals were numerous. He Jin knew the eunuchs had spies in his own household. He knew that his half-sister, the Empress Dowager, was sympathetic to the eunuchs because they had helped her son become emperor. He knew that summoning a frontier warlord like Dong Zhuo to Luoyang would be seen as a threat by the eunuchs. Yet he did not secure the palace first. He did not strengthen his personal guard. He walked into the meeting without weapons, without backup, without a plan. The eunuchs, by contrast, were acting with desperate precision. They had nothing to lose. They were cornered and they struck first. When Yuan Shao responded by burning the palace and killing indiscriminately, he destroyed more than the eunuch faction. He destroyed the last vestige of Han's central authority. The palace was the symbol of the emperor's rule. Its destruction signaled to every warlord in the empire that the capital was no longer safe. The court could no longer protect itself. The emperor was a pawn. Within weeks, Dong Zhuo arrived at the gates of Luoyang with a large army. He had been summoned by He Jin before his death and had marched slowly, waiting to see who would win. When he saw that the palace was in chaos and the emperor was unprotected, he entered the capital unopposed. Yuan Shao and his allies had no plan to stop him. They had spent all their energy on destroying the eunuchs. They had no reserve force, no diplomatic strategy, no unified command. Dong Zhuo immediately took control of the young emperor. He deposed him a few months later, replacing him with his younger brother, the Prince of Chenliu, who became Emperor Xian. The deposed Emperor Liu Bian was poisoned soon after. Dong Zhuo then ordered the entire capital of Luoyang to be evacuated and burned. He did not want to leave any resources for his enemies. The city that had been the heart of the Han Empire for 2 centuries was systematically destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians were forced to march west to Chang'an. The old capital was looted, then set on fire. The libraries were burned. The imperial archives, which held centuries of documents and histories, were destroyed in the flames. The cultural memory of the Han Dynasty was literally reduced to ash. Historians have pieced together the events of this period from fragments, tomb inscriptions, local records, and the accounts written later by survivors like Kai Yan, a poetess who was captured by nomadic tribes during the chaos. What they found was a pattern of cascading failures. The first failure was the lack of a clear succession. Emperor Ling had died in 189 AD, leaving 2 sons by different mothers. The eunuchs had supported the elder son, Liu Bian, because his mother had been a concubine they could control. The scholar officials had supported the younger son, Liu Zai, because they believed he was more capable. He Jin, as the elder's uncle, had backed the eunuch's choice, but then had turned against them. The infighting over the succession created a power vacuum that no one could fill. The second failure was the breakdown of communication between the court and the provinces. After the Yellow Turban Rebellion, regional governors had become virtual independent rulers. They raised their own taxes, appointed their own officials, and commanded their own armies. When Dongzhu seized the capital, they did not rush to defend it. They waited to see if they could profit from the chaos. Yuan Shao, who had fled Luoyang after Dongzhu's arrival, raised an army in the northeast and declared himself a rebel against the new regime. Other warlords followed suit. The empire fractured into competing coalitions. The Han Emperor, now a puppet in Dongzhu's hands, could only watch. The third failure was the loss of legitimacy. The Han Dynasty had ruled by the mandate of heaven, a doctrine that said heaven would withdraw its support from a corrupt and unjust ruler. The burning of Luoyang, the murder of the emperor, the destruction of the archives, these were not just political crimes. They were spiritual catastrophes. The common people, who had already suffered through famine, banditry, and the Yellow Turban War, now saw their capital destroyed by their own generals. They began to believe that the mandate of heaven had indeed passed to someone else. But to whom? No warlord had the moral authority to claim it. The Han name continued, but the reality was dead. The human consequences were staggering. The population of the North China Plain, which had already been reduced by the Yellow Turban Rebellion, fell further. Famine, disease, and war killed millions. The great city of Luoyang, which had once housed over 500,000 people, was reduced to rubble. The fields around it were left untilled. The irrigation canals, built over centuries, were neglected and silted up. Refugees fled south across the Yangtze River, where the climate was wetter and the warlords were less aggressive. This migration shifted the center of Chinese civilization southward for the first time. The north, the ancestral homeland of the Han people, became a battlefield. What systems failed? The most critical system was the military command structure. The Han Empire had maintained a professional army under central control for most of its history. But after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, that army had been disbanded or merged with local militias. The new regional armies were loyal to their commanders, not to the emperor. They fought for their own survival and plunder. There was no mechanism to recall them or to enforce discipline. When Dongzhu marched into Luoyang, no imperial guard stood in his way. He simply walked in. The fiscal system also collapsed. The Han treasury had been depleted by the suppression of the Yellow Turbans and by the cost of maintaining the imperial court. The land tax, which had been the main source of revenue, could no longer be collected because the land was not producing. The court had begun minting coins with less silver, causing inflation. By 190 AD, the economy of the empire was effectively barter. Soldiers were paid in grain and cloth. Officials were paid in promises. The imperial government could no longer fund its own operations. The legal system failed as well. The Han Code of Law had been detailed and harsh, but it had provided a framework for justice. After the massacre of the eunuchs, there was no one to enforce the law. Local magistrates were killed or fled. The warlords imposed their own rules which changed constantly. Crimes went unpunished. Disputes were settled by force. The common people had no recourse, no protection, no hope. Why does this still matter? Because the collapse of the Han Dynasty was not a random event. It was a textbook case of how a great empire can fall due to internal contradictions. The Han had grown too large, too bureaucratic, too rigid. It could not adapt to the changing conditions of the 2nd century AD. The climate was cooling, the harvests were shrinking, the population was growing. The system of land distribution, which had once allowed peasant families to own small farms, had been replaced by large estates owned by the wealthy. The peasants had been pushed off the land, becoming tenants or bandits. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was the explosion of that pressure. The massacre of 189 AD was the aftershock. The unanswered questions remain. Could the Han have survived if He Jin had acted differently? If he had killed the eunuchs quietly, without summoning Dong Zhuo? If Yuan Shao had not burned the palace? The evidence suggests that the disease was already terminal. The military, fiscal, and legal systems had been rotting for decades. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was the first symptom. The massacre was the second. The destruction of Luoyang was the third. By the time Dong Zhuo died in 192 AD, assassinated by his own subordinate Lu Bu, the Han Dynasty was already a corpse. It would take another 30 years for the final emperor to abdicate, but those years were merely a funeral. In those years, the warlords fought the Three Kingdoms Wars. Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan carved up the empire. They claimed to be restoring the Han, but they were building their own dynasties. The common people, caught between armies, suffered beyond description. There are accounts of cannibalism during the sieges. There are records of entire villages being wiped out by disease. The population of China fell by an estimated 2/3 between 150 and 250 AD. The Han Dynasty, which had ruled for 4 centuries, left behind a depopulated, ruined landscape. The legacy of the Han, however, did not disappear. Its language, its script, its legal principles, and its cultural ideals survived in the memory of the educated elite. When later dynasties, like the Tang, rebuilt a unified Chinese state, they consciously modeled themselves on the Han. The name Han became the ethnic identifier of the Chinese people themselves. The collapse of the Han was therefore not the end of Chinese civilization. It was a reset, a painful transformation that burned away the old structures and allowed new ones to grow. But that transformation was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions made by men who were too proud, too afraid, too ambitious, or too confused to take the right action. The eunuchs who killed He Jin were acting out of fear. Yuan Shao was acting out of rage. Dong Zhuo was acting out of greed. The common people were acting out of desperation. No one was evil in the way that monsters are evil. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, making choices that seemed reasonable at the time and that led, step by step, to disaster. The lesson of the Han Dynasty is that empires are not destroyed by external enemies. They are destroyed by internal failures. The Xingnu nomads, the Huns, the tribes of the north, they were never able to conquer the Han in its prime. The empire fell because it could no longer feed its people, govern its provinces, or maintain the loyalty of its army. The mandate of heaven was not taken by force. It was given up incrementally by those who had lost the will to keep it. In the winter of 190 AD, the last emperor of the Western Han, Liu Zai, was taken to Chang'an by Dong Zhuo's general. The city was cold and the palace was half-built. The young emperor, then 9 years old, sat on a makeshift throne and watched his captors argue over who would control him. He had no power, no advisors, no future. The empire that had defined China for 4 centuries was over. What came next would be called the Three Kingdoms, an era of war and heroism that Chinese legend would remember forever. But the empire that had defined China, the Han, was gone, and it would never return. In the spring of 192 AD, a warlord named Lu Bu walked into a council chamber in Chang'an. He was carrying a halberd. The meeting was a routine gathering of Dong Zhuo's senior officers. The tyrant sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his guards and advisors. The atmosphere was tense, as it always was under Dong Zhuo's rule. At a signal, Lu Bu stepped forward and drove the halberd through Dong Zhuo's chest. The guards did not move. They had been bought. The assassination was over in seconds. Dong Zhuo, the man who had burned Luoyang, murdered the empress and terrorized the imperial court, lay dead on the floor. The crowd in the council chamber erupted in cheers. What happened next was not a restoration. It was a scramble. Lu Bu expected to be rewarded as the savior of the dynasty. He had been Dong Zhuo's adopted son and chief bodyguard. He believed that by killing the tyrant, he would be hailed as a liberator. Instead, the other warlords saw him as a traitor. They did not trust a man who could kill his own patron. Within months, Lu Bu was driven out of Chang'an by Dong Zhuo's former generals. He fled east, taking a small army with him. The capital fell into the hands of yet another warlord, Li Ju, who looted what remained of the city. The emperor, Liu Zai, was now a pawn in the hands of a new master. The death of Dong Zhuo did not end the chaos, it deepened it. The warlords, who had once been united by their hatred of Dong Zhuo, now turned on each other. The empire dissolved into a dozen warring states. Each claimed to be the legitimate heir of the Han, but none had the power or the moral authority to unite the country. The common people saw their villages burned again and again. Armies crossed the same fields, fighting for crops that had already been harvested. Famine became so severe that in some regions, families sold their children into slavery for a few measures of grain. How could this have happened? The system that had held the Han together for 4 centuries was a delicate balance of central authority, local loyalty, and economic stability. That balance had been broken by the Yellow Turban Rebellion, when the central government gave regional commanders the power to raise their own armies. Once that power was given, it could not be taken back. The warlords no longer needed the emperor. They only needed his name, his seal, his symbolic approval. The emperor became a rubber stamp, passed from one warlord to another like a trophy. Investigators of history have tried to pinpoint the exact moment when the Han Dynasty became irrecoverable. Some point to the year 189 AD, when the massacre of the eunuchs emptied the palace of its administrative class. Others point to 190 AD, when Luoyang burned. But the evidence suggests that the disease had been spreading for decades. The land tax system had collapsed. The census population had fallen from 60 million to under 20 million. The irrigation networks that fed the North China Plain had been neglected for a generation. The empire was no longer producing enough food to feed its army, its bureaucracy, or its people. The human consequences continued to unfold long after the assassination. Lu Bu, after being driven from Chang'an, wandered from province to province, fighting battles he could not win. He was finally captured and executed by Cao Cao in 198 AD. His body was hung from a bridge as a warning. The people who had cheered his assassination of Dong Zhuo now cursed his name. He had brought nothing but more war. Why does this still matter? Because the fall of the Han Dynasty set a template for imperial collapse that would repeat itself across Chinese history. Every subsequent dynasty, the Tang, the Song, the Ming, would face the same internal contradictions. The concentration of land in the hands of the powerful, the breakdown of the tax system, the rise of regional military commanders, and the final loss of the mandate of heaven. The Han was the first, but it was not the last. The story of its collapse is not just a story about one dynasty. It is a story about the fragility of any system built on trust, law, and shared belief. The unanswered questions linger. Could Dong Zhuo have been stopped earlier? Could the emperor have escaped his captors? Could the warlords have negotiated a peace? The evidence suggests that by the time the halberd struck, the empire had already been dead for years. The Han name continued until 220 AD, when the last emperor abdicated to Cao Pai, the son of Cao Cao. But that abdication was a formality. The real empire, the one that had built the Great Wall, codified Confucianism, and invented paper, had already vanished into the dust of Chang'an.